Hello, hello, and thank you so much for joining me today on the Community Ledger. You are not going to believe which two parties came together to sit down and have a real conversation. Stephen A. Smith and Ben Shapiro. Let's get into it. So today we are going to talk about the interview between Stephen A. Smith and Ben Shapiro. Yes, okay. And so for those who may not be aware, Ben Shapiro has been pushing for Donald Trump to pardon Derek Chauvin. Yes, the Derek Chauvin who was convicted of unaliving George Floyd. And so, of course, for many people, this is a very hot topic, very touchy subject. People all over the world witnessed the video of George Floyd being unalived and Derek Chauvin being the cop who held his knee on his neck. And so a lot of people worldwide celebrated when Derek Chauvin was convicted. They felt like he was guilty, and a jury of his peers felt the same way. However, Ben Shapiro, okay, I do apologize. It sounds like it's a truck outside. Nonetheless, however, Ben Shapiro thinks something different. He feels like Derek Chauvin should be set free. And so let's go ahead and get into this conversation.
So we're going to get right into that. Please welcome to the show the one and only Mr. Ben Shapiro. Ben, how are you, sir? How's everything?
Thank God, doing well, Stephen. How are you doing?
Okay, I want to ask, and I asked this affectionately. I'm not trying to be incendiary. You called me a jackass. How many dudes do you call a jackass, and then you go on this show? Could you tell me that? Could you answer that one first?
Hey, I appreciate you having me on, and the invitation, as you know, is open the other way around. It's shockingly, the answer is probably a lot, actually, in terms of the number of people who I've called a jackass who I've then actually become friendly with, or who I've had on the show, or vice versa. So you're in this business, you know it.
I got you. I'm not overly offended. Trust me on that. All right. But thank you for coming on the show. So let's get right into it. As you know, I spoke out against your petition to get President Trump to pardon former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. For those that don't know, Chauvin was sentenced to 22 years in prison after being convicted of unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter of George Floyd. I wondered if you would feel that way if the officer was black and the victim was Jewish. That was what I said. And your response was to call me a race baiter. Why is that, Ben Shapiro?
Well, to me, the entire case against Derek Chauvin was rooted in a sort of public racial essentialism that I thought was unnecessary to analyze the case. If I'm going to look at this case and just look at the facts of the case, the race of the person on the ground and the race of the officer are irrelevant, and we should treat it exactly the same, whether both people were black, both people are white, one person was Jewish, one person was not Jewish. The identity of the person on the ground, I think, should not be the deciding factor in whether or not Derek Chauvin was convicted of second-degree murder. It should be the situation, the facts of the case, the autopsy report, and all of the rest. And so the thing that I actually objected to was the suggestion that my opinion would have changed, rooted in the, say, racial or religious identity of the person who died, as opposed to the racial or religious identity of the person who was the police officer. I just don't think that that's how we ought to decide criminal justice cases in general.
In fairness to you, I can understand that in general. Damn it, in most instances, I can agree with that. But those are cases that we hear about. I'm talking about the visual impact. So let's stay right there, Ben. I am a black man, and I see this black man on the ground, face down, handcuffs behind him. Face is imprinted into the pavement. The knee of the police officer is on the back of his neck. He's literally saying he can't breathe, to one point crying for his mama. And it happens for over 9 minutes. I understand from a technical perspective, from a specific analytical perspective, forensic evidence, et cetera, fentanyl in the system, et cetera. I got all of that. My point is, and my question to you at that time was, seeing that, how could you have another opinion? How could it be based on the preponderance of evidence that you threw into the fray in order to ask for this man to be pardoned? I'm just going by, like, there are certain things that you just see, and 1 + 1 = 2.
So, I mean, Stephen, actually, if you go back to my tweets at the time, May 30th and June 1st, if you look at my tweets, I'm saying the same kind of things you're saying right now. I'm saying the same kind of things at that time that everybody else is saying, seeing the tape, because there's no way to look at the tape.
I saw that.
And not be sort of shocked by what you're seeing on the tape, obviously. And then I think that the mark of a reasonable person is to change your opinion as the evidence changes. A lot of evidence emerged between the time that the tape was released, that horrible 9-minute tape, and the time the conviction actually happened. I mean, there's a full trial, there were autopsy reports, there was witness evidence, there were other people whose testimony was taken, there were multiple medical specialists who were called. And so in looking at all of that, that's the way we're supposed to adjudicate whether or not a person deserves to spend 22 years in prison, not based simply on our immediate gut response to the tape. And again, I had the same gut response to the tape that you did, and I think that everybody did. I think actually that tends to be the gut response of people when we see a lot of police activity. Actually, it turns out that police do a lot of things that look really rough on tape and really difficult on tape. And this was one of those things. And then as we later learned that, for example, the sort of tactic that Chauvin is using there was actually trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, right? It's a submission technique that's used if you have a person who's resisting arrest, or if you learn during the course of the investigation that George Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe," before he was even taken out of the car. He says, "I can't breathe" on the longer tape 6 times before he's even taken out of the car. I mean, it's a very long interaction with the police officers before you get to that 9-minute tape, the part that we all saw. And there's a part of the story that you can't see on the tape, which is the reverse angle. You can't see that there's a big crowd that's shouting at Chauvin. Chauvin is responding to that crowd. One of the preliminaries to getting up off of Floyd that way is to call what's called a code 4, which is where it's an all clear, where you feel that the crowd is not a threat to you. In fact, even the EMTs who showed up to provide care for Floyd didn't call a code 4 when they arrived on scene because they thought that the crowd was too threatening. So once you take into account all of the facts, if your opinion doesn't change and the fact pattern is different from what you originally thought it was, then you're not doing your job as a commentator. So I can have the same gut response that you have when I first see that tape. The question is what you do when more of those facts emerge, when you do see more of that evidence emerge, when you do read the testimony and see the autopsies.
See, but I believe, and this is just my belief, because in fairness to you, you're absolutely right. You did put out that tweet initially, and your position was it was shared by the Hannitys of the world, the Mark Levins of the world, and various others, obviously with a lot of people on the left as well, before the preponderance of evidence that you're alluding to came into play. I get that. So in fairness to you, I have to say that. But sometimes I'm going to say this to you because you're a pretty brilliant dude. Nobody can deny it. Well, what you've accomplished with the Daily Wire, what you've been able to do in your career. I'm just reading something. You were a syndicated columnist at the age of 17, for crying out loud. This is who you are. This is who I'm talking to here. Is it possible that sometimes we could be so brilliant that our intellect gets in the way of common sense? For example, what I mean by that is this, Ben. It was a knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes. If that didn't happen, is he still alive? I'm not talking about today because anything could have happened to you. I'm just saying the fact that Derek Chauvin's knee was on his neck, that to me should speak for itself, because if the man is clamoring for you to get off the back of his neck while you got him handcuffed into the ground, okay, why is it wrong for us to stop there and say, that was excessive on the part of the police officer because you had him contained. He wasn't a threat to you. What's wrong with that thinking?
Okay, so there are a couple of things that could be argued by the defense, and in fact were argued by the defense in this case. One of them, again, was that this was a trained technique by the Minneapolis Police Department to keep somebody in this position so long as you have not called a code 4, which is where you say there's an all clear, and now you can move the person who's on the ground into the ambulance, for example, if you've already called the ambulance, or back into the police vehicle. When it comes to the actual question as to causation of death, right, you have to be the proximate cause of the death. It's not just enough for it to be a contributing factor, because it turns out that increased stress can cause death in a person who has a human heart that is significantly larger than normal. The autopsy showed that Floyd, unfortunately, had an incredibly enlarged heart, much heavier than normal. His lungs were much larger than normal person's lungs because of heavy and over time drug use. He had 11 nanograms of fentanyl in his system at the time per milliliter of blood, which is.
So I'm just going to pause there for a minute because he did say a lot, and I don't want to just continue to just keep playing it through. So, Ben Shapiro's basic argument is going to be that there's reasonable doubt. So he's going to feel like, or position himself in the manner in which it's like, okay, yes, Derek Chauvin did have his knee on George Floyd's neck. However, there were all of these underlying issues health-wise that George Floyd had, which could have contributed to his demise. And of course, Stephen A. Smith is saying, yes, but had his knee not been on his neck, he have met the same demise. So was Derek Chauvin's foot on his neck or knee on his neck the catalyst that brought about his ultimate unaliving? And so, that is ultimately what the debate is about. Now, with regards to Derek Chauvin's argument, he's saying, yes, it could have been a contributing factor, but based on evidence, there is reasonable doubt there to maybe Derek Chauvin's knee was not what caused the death of George Floyd. My sentiment is going to be, as a trained police officer, okay, whether George Floyd had underlying health issues or not, you are a trained police officer. And although you are trained to hold arrestees in this position, you are responsible for his care. And at a certain point, you had to make an authoritative decision to reposition yourself. Okay. And so whether somebody is handcuffed, under arrest, no matter what the scenario is, you have an obligation as a civil servant to make sure that that person is cared for, in my perspective. Okay. And so, he talks about the crowd and all of the people screaming the crowd was dangerous, yada, yada, yada. To me, that is hogwash, because the people are incensed. The people are enraged by what they're seeing. What they're seeing is a Black man. We'll say, we don't even care what his color is. We'll just say, hypothetically, he is a white man. It doesn't matter his race. We see a man on the ground, handcuffed, with a police officer on his back, his knee on his back, and the man is shouting and screaming that he can't breathe. They're recording. We see him urinate on himself. He's spitting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what is enraging the crowd. So common sense tells me maybe I should stop doing the thing that is inciting the crowd. Very simple. If people are not liking what they see, maybe I can reposition myself. Derek Chauvin was not the only officer on the scene. There were multiple people on the scene. So it wasn't like if he lifted his knee that, George Floyd was going to take up and jump up and take off. That is not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a man who showed a large amount of arrogance, a huge amount of unconcern and disregard for not only George Floyd's life, but the crowd. Okay. And so everyone's screaming at him, telling him to get off of George Floyd in that way. And he refused. And so in my opinion, that makes him culpable. Okay. And so when he gets a manslaughter conviction, to me, it's justified, because you could have made the decision to reposition yourself. You could have made the decision to ensure that this man was breathing properly before you continued the arrest, but you failed to do so. And that is negligence. Okay. And you are a civil servant. You are trained in these things, and this person is in your custody. And so you are responsible for their care. And because you showed that negligence and that complete disregard for his well-being, his safety, and his life, you are held accountable. And for those reasons, I do not think he deserves a pardon. But Ben Shapiro is going to continue.
Blood, which is over 3 times what it would cause normally to kill somebody. The original autopsy report openly said that if George Floyd had been found in his house in the same exact physical condition, they would have called it death by overdose. So, all of these things taken into account raises the question of reasonable doubt, right? The standard in our criminal justice system is, in fact, a reasonable doubt standard. And that raises the question as to why there's not, at the very least, reasonable doubt. So you can say that your sort of first jump at this.
Yes, but that's the thing. If he would have went home that night and had an overdose, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Those things didn't happen. So we can't start imagining what would have happened if. All we can focus on is exactly what was in front of us. And what was in front of us is that George Floyd was alive. And when he was no longer in the custody Of Derek Chauvin, he was not. And so we can't concern ourselves what would have happened had he gone home later that night. All we can concern ourselves with this window of time. And when he was in Derek Chauvin's custody, he was living. Okay. There was breath in his lungs and his heart was beating. Once he was no longer in Derek Chauvin's care, when Derek Chauvin's foot was or knee was no longer on his neck, there was no longer life in George Floyd. And so all of this other stuff that you want to throw in is not relevant. It's not relevant.
Is he's guilty. Look at the knee on his neck. There's no damage to his neck tissue, by the way, in the autopsy report. You can say all of that, and you can say that that's a plausible explanation. I won't even make the case that that's not a plausible explanation. I'll make the case that a plausible explanation is not enough to convict a man in court, especially based on the surrounding circumstances, the amount of pressure that was brought. This was not a fair trial, was one of the points that I made.
And I'm going to push back on that because he said because this was so publicized, it was not a fair trial. I disagree because there was another trial that was just as polarizing with Trayvon Martin. Okay. So when Obama was the president, you had another Black man being killed by someone who was not Black, right? Very polarizing. Incredibly polarizing, lots of tension in these communities. And what happened? Zimmerman was exonerated. Okay. Zimmerman was exonerated. Now, many people obviously do not agree with that verdict, but based on the evidence in the state of Florida and the jury of his peers, they felt like he was able to use the, stand your ground laws and he was exonerated. Now we have another polarizing incident of a Black man being unalived by someone who is not Black, and he is convicted. So my sentiment is this: if both trials went to court and the juries of their peers made a decision, then we got to respect it. We did not like, the acquittal of Zimmerman, but we had to accept it. Okay. Ben Shapiro may not like the decision that was handed down to Derek Chauvin, but he got to accept it. He got to accept it. And trying to ask Trump to pardon this man based on his own personal opinions is hogwash. And if that's the case, then you need to be telling them to retry Zimmerman if you can just cherry pick who you think should and shouldn't be convicted.
So when it comes to the actual trial itself, there are members of the jury who are at actual rallies wearing shirts that said "I can't breathe" before they were actually on the jury. There are members of the jury who have openly said,
I mean, truth be told, it is relevant because you don't want a juror that's actually going to have an awareness of the case. But at the same time, I mean, it was everywhere. To be able to find somebody who was not familiar with what was happening with George Floyd, I mean, they would have had to come from like under a rock somewhere. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be incredibly difficult to find that person.
that they felt public pressure to convict in a particular way. The president of the United States, or one of the people who was running for president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, was openly calling for his conviction.
And again, I give the same example as Trayvon Martin, and still incredibly polarizing, still public pressure to convict, and the judge and the jury did not.
Minneapolis City paid the family of George Floyd, I believe it was a $27 million payout in the middle of the trial. So all of this tends to go to, is that an impartial jury, right? These all have serious consequences for the jury system. And so there's really a few separate questions. One is, was Chauvin responsible for Floyd's death? I think on that question, I would say no. You can say yes. I would say at the very least, there's reasonable doubt. And then there's the question of the amount of pressure that was brought on the jury in this particular case to bring a verdict. This was the most highly publicized trial of the modern era by a long shot, because the incident itself had spurred so much public angst and outrage and massive protests involving 20 million people and riots that had cost the taxpayers some $2 billion, or insurance companies some $2 billion. It was the most highly publicized trial probably since the OJ trial. And
I mean, you talk about OJ, but we've had several incidences and several trials that have been polarizing. Maybe not as polarizing as George Floyd, but definitely, definitely in the public eye. Definitely all the way to the fact that the presidents have been speaking on what is happening. You had Ahmaud Arbery just a few years back. That case was, I sat and watched that case from beginning to end. and you had large vast of people who thought that they needed to be prosecuted, and those two men were prosecuted for unaliving Ahmaud Arbery. However, with the Trayvon Martin, again, very polarizing. Obama spoke about that case. Many people spoke about that case, and Zimmerman was exonerated. So you can't just say that because George Floyd's case was so polarizing that he didn't get a fair shot. That's BS. That's BS.
Because of that amount of public pressure, did Chauvin receive a fair trial is obviously a very crucial question here. Or one of the people who was running for president of the United States at the time, Joe.
I look at, and this is where I wanted to go as well. I'm looking at a Ben Shapiro, and this is what I meant when I asked the question about you being, about if George Floyd was a Jewish person. I owe you an explanation for that, so I want to give it to you right now. You are known as a proud Jewish individual, incredibly supportive of the Jewish community, being amongst them, Israel, other things. And I was bringing this up because I said, if that were a Jewish person, the conclusion that you ultimately reached, would you have been patient enough to draw that conclusion, peeling from the information that was deduced on an objective level to reach the conclusion that, hey, you know what? I don't think he should have been put in jail. That's where I was going, because I know how defensive, or I shouldn't say defensive, but a defender of the Jewish community that you are. And that's what I was thinking along those lines.
I mean, but I certainly hope so, because I can name you a dozen Jewish criminals who absolutely deserve to be in jail, right? And Jeffrey Epstein was a Jew.
No, I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
Hell, right? I mean, I think that
I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
And my point is that whenever, I'm also a lawyer, right? I mean, my identity as a Jew does not mean I have solidarity with a criminal who happens to be a Jew, or a person who's in a controversial law enforcement confrontation who happens to be a Jew. I mean, my job is to literally remove myself from the, and I think also that, as those original tweets show, I don't think that you have to have racial solidarity with a person in order to feel empathy for that person's situation. I think that the whole basis of a democratic republic, or us having a conversation right now, is the fact that we can speak to each other across racial and identitarian lines. Right. And so, again, I think that there are an enormous number of people in the country who disagree with me, by the way, who share both my race, and a lot of Jews who, I would say the vast majority of Jews disagree with me on this, or many white Americans who looked at George Floyd and had exactly the same reaction. And as you say, initially, I had the same reaction as you, and that had nothing to do with race. And so the kind of idea that let's put it this way, if race is a barrier to logic, then race is the problem, not the solution. Let me ask you this. I mean, if you looked at, you said before that you didn't look at the autopsy report, you're not taking a lot of time looking at the evidence for the autopsy. What would it take for you to...
How defensive, or I shouldn't say defensive, but a defender of the Jewish community that you are. And that's what I was thinking along those lines.
I mean, but I certainly hope so, because I can name you a dozen Jewish criminals who absolutely deserve to be in jail, right? And Jeffrey Epstein was a Jew.
No, I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
Hell, right? I mean, I think that
I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
And my point is that whenever, I'm also a lawyer, right? I mean, my identity as a Jew does not mean I have solidarity with a criminal who happens to be a Jew, or a person who's in a controversial law enforcement confrontation who happens to be a Jew. I mean, my job is to literally remove myself from the, and I think also that, as those original tweets show, I don't think that you have to have racial solidarity with a person in order to feel empathy for that person's situation. I think that the whole basis of a democratic republic, or us having a conversation right now, is the fact that we can speak to each other across racial and identitarian lines. Right. And so, again, I think that there are an enormous number of people in the country who disagree with me, by the way, who share both my race, and a lot of Jews who, I would say the vast majority of Jews disagree with me on this, or many white Americans who looked at George Floyd and had exactly the same reaction. And as you say, initially, I had the same reaction as you, and that had nothing to do with race. And so the kind of idea that let's put it this way, if race is a barrier to logic, then race is the problem, not the solution. Right? Let me ask you this. I mean, if you looked at, you said before that you didn't look at the autopsy report, you're not taking a lot of time looking at the evidence for the autopsy. What would it take for you to change your mind on the case? Or is there nothing that could change your mind on the case because you saw the tape, for example?
Well, it wouldn't take much, and this is why I said this, because normally I would look at the autopsy reports or whatever. And I saw people bringing up his arrest record. I saw people bringing up fentanyl in the system. I saw all of these things. And all I could come to, Ben, fair or unfair, was that none of that matters if he wasn't on the ground with a knee on the back of his neck for 9+ minutes. Because I'm looking at a trained police officer who should know better. I looked at the experts who were saying, they're trained. There was no reason, and you saw it. I'm sure you saw this, and not to say that you would embrace it with the level of sincerity that others may, because I know the level of skepticism that you look at when you see the news outlets. And by the way, I don't blame you. I'm with you on that, okay? But I would say to you, listening to experts talk about how police officers are trained and pointing to the fact that Derek Chauvin had no business being in that position and putting George Floyd in that position, particularly once he was handcuffed and contained. To me, that, along with the ultimate outcome, is all the evidence I need. And that's where we might differ.
Right. I mean, that's totally fair if we differ on that. I guess the question I would ask you is, given the fact that that was a Minneapolis Police Department trained protocol, given the fact that Floyd did ask to be removed from the car, I mean, in the lead up to this situation, the part of the tape that nobody watches, he was actually outside the car. The police officers move him inside the car. He says he's claustrophobic, and then he claims 6 consecutive times that he cannot breathe while he's in the car. So if the idea is that it was the police officer's knee that deprived him of breath, he was already claiming that he couldn't breathe inside the car, suggesting he was already in the middle of some sort of medical event, right? And then he was brought outside the car. I guess the question that I have for you, again, is what level of evidence would need to be shown to for you to get to reasonable doubt? I mean, you seem incredibly certain, right? All I'm saying is that the reasonable doubt standard is what pertains in criminal justice. What would it take to get you to reasonable doubt? Or is there no reasonable doubt that could be achieved simply by dint of the fact that he had his knee on his neck? By the way, it's not for the full 9 minutes. There are minutes where it's on his back. I mean, even the prosecution acknowledges that. The real question is, I think, the last 50 seconds, right? The last 50 seconds of the tape where Floyd stops breathing and Chauvin's knee is still on his neck. That is really the question as to whether this goes into criminal charge territory. Otherwise, he ends up being in a position where he's actually just using a typical subdual technique before you put the guy back in the car and you take him off to jail.
And I'm saying, to answer your question, there's absolutely nothing that could convince me that Derek Chauvin deserved a different outcome because of what you just articulated, what we saw, even if it's for the last 50 seconds. I'm not changing my position. I understand where you're coming from.
I mean, this is a real question. Do you think so? We've talked about race a little bit. Do you think that Chauvin was a racist? This was a race-based crime, in your view?
Do I believe that?
Yes.
I don't believe that based on anything about his history that they articulated, because I know how people conjure up evidence to go at it. I do believe his actions indicated that, because I didn't see him doing that with.
So he wants to know if he believes, or Stephen believes, that this was race related. We'll just say, for the sake of argument, it was not. It had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Derek Chauvin was a white cop, and nothing to do with the fact that George Floyd was a black man. So even if we just say these are just two people, one civilian, one police officer, there was neglect for his life and his well-being based on that officer. There was neglect of that civilian under arrest by that officer, period. Period. So if race played a part in it, it is a possibility. However, even when you remove race from it, Derek Chauvin is culpable for the unaliving of George Floyd. No matter what the optics, no matter what anybody's race, this is a civilian. You are a trained professional, and you acted with negligence and complete disregard for this man's safety, well-being, and overall life. And because of that negligence, he is no longer here today. And that's all that matters. So even if we want to take race out of it, the facts remain.
With anybody else, and the times that we were living in, and the climate, as you articulated accurately, I might add, the heightened level of sensitivity that it exists because of brutality on the part of some police officers. By the way, I never say police brutality, because I don't like to castigate all police officers that way. I know if I'm in trouble, I'm calling 911. I'm not going to sit up there and denigrate police officers throughout this country. But there's rogues that exist in every profession, and I think there's rogues that exist with certain police officers. So to me, he came across as one, and that was my problem with it. Having said that, I want to get to something else, because we're going to stay on this subject of race in this regard. When you saw the climate that exists, I understand you believe it was primarily instigated by the left. I want to know where you draw the line in the sand, and in terms of veering away from the political and just looking at a case on its merit and saying, this is what I see, This is where I stand, completely devoid of politics. I'm not talking race, I'm talking politics, meaning this has nothing to do with politics. This is the climate that we're living in. This officer should have known better, etc. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you're able to dismiss yourself from the political impact of something or the political agenda of something to draw your conclusions?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think that in this particular case, this is a good indicator of trying to withdraw from a political sort of calculation, given the fact that, as some people have pointed out, on a pragmatic level, they've suggested that President Trump pardoning Derek Chauvin would be bad for President Trump politically. And the case that I've made is that's his job, to determine what's pragmatic for him politically. It's my job to call something out as wrong when I see it to be wrong. In terms of criminal justice cases,
That's convenient. That's convenient. It's his job to call out something being wrong when he sees it as such. And then, the president should acquiesce. Obviously, Trump is going to be the one to make the ultimate decision, but I just find it incredibly convenient. Convenient timing. Okay. Because I don't recall, and you can totally correct me if I'm wrong, I do not recall Ben Shapiro requesting that Biden pardon Derek Chauvin. Matter of fact, I'm gonna go ahead and look it up. Let me just go ahead and ask ChatGPT to see exactly what the truth is regarding this. Said, if memory serves me correctly, Ben Shapiro was not requesting or advocating for Joe Biden to pardon Derek Chauvin. So if you felt so passionate about it, why did you wait until Trump was in office? Biden was handing out pardons like Halloween candy, like Christmas gifts. So if any president should have been the one, pulled to the side and say, well, since giving out all these pardons, why don't you go ahead and pardon Derek Chauvin? And here is why. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that. He waited until Trump got in office before he made this request. And I find the timing to be quite interesting.
that have involved race, where I've removed myself on the other side. I mean, there are a bunch of them. Walter Scott, right, is a great example of a black man who was victimized by a white police officer. The police officer ends up convicted and going to jail. You're saying I'm not campaigning on his behalf because he deserves to go to jail, the officer in the Walter Scott case. There have been a number of horrifying or police-involved crimes in which the police officer deserves to lose his job and or go to jail, depending on the activities of the police officer. And you have to analyze those one by one. And I think that what we've seen, particularly from the legacy media over the course of the last many years, is that the only types of stories that tend to break into the news are ones with a black victim and a white police officer. And the media immediately jump to a particular narrative conclusion on the basis of that. And even if the facts end up debunking that conclusion, that narrative continues to be maintained. I mean, a good example of this might be Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where the initial claim was that Michael Brown was shot in the back by a police officer in cold blood. And it turned out that every aspect of that story was false. And yet there are still people who will, sort of repeat the hands up, don't shoot lie that never happened. I mean, that literally never happened. And that was debunked by the Eric Holder Department of Justice, for example. So I think that we really do have to look at each one of these situations in isolation. We're talking about the life of a person. If you're talking about narrative, if you're talking about sort of generalized race in America, then I think that it's important to look at as much data as humanly possible. I'm a data-driven person, and so I'll look at everything from the studies of Roland Fryer over at Harvard University about police misconduct toward minorities, and it ranges on the scale, by the way. What Roland Fryer studies tend to show is that, for example, there is no disproportionate.
Okay. So he's going to go on and on and on. And he's data driven, right? And we need to really look into this case with regards to Derek Chauvin, because this is someone's life we're speaking about. And I agree. I 100% agree. This is someone's life. This is someone that's going to be spending, a large amount of their time in prison. That is a very serious situation. However, Derek Chauvin was not considerate of George Floyd's life when he arrested him that day. Okay. Derek Chauvin was not considerate of George Floyd's life when he held him in that position for the amount of time that he did. Derek Chauvin did not show concern for George Floyd's life when you had paramedics and witnesses screaming to reposition himself and allow the man to breathe. Derek Chauvin showed no regard for Derek Chauvin's life in that moment on that day, and thus the reason he is sitting in prison right now. And so, this video is very, very long. I'm going to go ahead and put the link in the description so you can watch it in its entirety. I did think it was a very interesting conversation. I, respect Stephen A. Jackson for holding the conversation and really getting to the nit and gritty as to why Ben Shapiro felt it was necessary to push Trump to pardon Chauvin. I think that Ben Chauvin is very articulate in his argument. However, I don't buy it. I feel like the positioning is very or incredibly disingenuous. I don't think his intentions are good. And we will see, whether or not Trump makes that move is on Trump. That will ultimately be his decision. I have my theories as to why Ben Shapiro is doing this. And I'll keep them to myself. But nonetheless, we will see. We do know that if something like this goes about, or even Trump tries to pardon him or reverse some sort of the charges, it would definitely be a stain on his legacy. It would definitely piss a lot of people off, not just people in the Black community, but other communities were negatively affected, were negatively were harmed emotionally and mentally by seeing that, and were saddened by that, and frustrated and appalled by what they saw by that officer. And so if Ben Shapiro, the Trump administration, is going to decide to reverse some of those charges, pardon him in some way, I think it would be an incredibly bad look. And for me, where Ben Shapiro is talking about all of this political discourse, and that race being incredibly polarizing, and something that's causing chaos in our country, why would you want to stoke the flames in this manner? And if the man was convicted by a jury of his peers, then so be it. Like, I don't think that is his place to try to cherry pick this particular case and decide that he feels that the president should act on it, especially when, there have been other cases in the past that were very racially polarizing that he has not chosen to bring to the attention of the public in terms of reversing the conviction. And like I said, I find the timing incredibly questionable with regards to the fact that he did not ask Biden, because, all of this happened not all of it happened, but a lot of it happened and was going on. The case and the trial and everything else was going on while Biden was the president and the administration. And for whatever reason, Ben Shapiro did not feel it's necessary to revisit this case or even request that Biden pardon him. Why? I don't know. Only he would know. But like I said, the timing is definitely interesting. But nonetheless, I would love to get your opinion about this conversation. How do you feel about this entire topic? Do you feel like Derek Chauvin should have his charges reversed? Do you even feel like maybe the case needs to be revisited? Does he need a new trial so that more evidence, like Ben Shapiro says, can be brought about? Yes, we know that it is a possibility that, George Floyd's health wasn't the best. However, he was walking, talking, and doing everything he usually does before his life intersected with Derek Chauvin's, and now he's no longer here. Nonetheless, if you even believe that he deserves a retrial. So I would love to hear your opinions, your comments. If you have not already, please do share, like, and subscribe. And until next time, this is the Community Lecture. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and watch the next video by clicking right here.